And everyone has that, men, women, everyone. Everyone has obstacles in their life where they feel like they have to make a decision that wasn't necessarily part of their plan. And I think women especially have to make those kinds of hard decisions.
Where the booze is for baking and the ass is for shaking. Welcome back to an in-studio version. Our first in-studio visit in around 16 months. I didn't do the math beforehand, Kenneth. I see you crunching numbers over there. My name's Mike Wolf, and along with me today is my co-host.
Me, Kenneth. Kenneth Dedman. I'm rusty, man. This will take a minute.
Yeah, great to be back here at We Own This Town Studios. Shout out to our producer, Michael Eads, and everybody at We Own This Town. Check it out at weownthistown.net. The music show, always a favorite, and they have a new podcast called Mom Cult. Mom Cult is real talk, real moms, real tired. So check that out. Today we have a very special guest. As we have started season 4, check out our first episode of season 4 with Miss Alice Randall, which is an amazing talk, one of my most favorite interviews I've ever had the pleasure to do. So please check out episode 1 of season 4. We're doing books and booze, and today we've got just a rock star, author, pastry chef, mother, hero to many. Lisa Donovan is in studio. Miss Lisa
Wow,
Donovan.
What an introduction, Mike Wolf. Thank you.
I was going to say like the Liberace of buttermilk pie, but that doesn't work.
I'll take it, though.
The Beyonce of buttermilk pie.
That's a stretch, but I'll take it as well.
I love it. Thanks so much for being here today. The paperback version of Lisa's debut novel and memoir, Our Lady of Perpetual Hunger. The paperback is out. So tell me a little bit, like what is that like going from the beautiful hardback cover that I have here that you will have to sign later? What is that like as you move into like the paperback world? You had mentioned, I'd heard on another interview where you mentioned like that it was like a permanent sort of thing. It gives it kind of permanence where it's like, this is how it's going to live. It's going to get out there. It's going to get in people's book bags and get on the beach with people, things like that. How does that make you feel as an author?
Good.
Yeah.
Like it feels like it's the final iteration of your book. It's the final state it will ever be in. And I don't know about you guys, but like I love a paperback. Like it's always like something that feels more accessible, and it feels like you're actually, I don't know, there's something a little more hospitable about the tactility of it. And there's like, you can fall asleep with it. You can throw it in your book bag. It's something you can carry with you. And I think it becomes even like more accessible financially for people. And I think, those are the books you read in high school are always these like softbound paperbacks, and you just kind of hope that they will find their way around the world. And it feels more natural for this book for me. And I didn't know that was going to happen. I didn't know I was going to get into paperback and feel like that was the state of its existence that was going to feel like the most rewarding, but it really, really is. And also, honestly, like last year was terrible. And coming out with a book last year was incredibly hard and difficult in addition to all the other things that were hard and difficult. And, it didn't take quite the priority as a lot of other things. So you kind of just moved through it and did your best. And the paperback has also been like a really good opportunity to re-engage with the material and the audience. And, things are, as far as COVID goes, not necessarily better, but we're moving around. We have vaccinations. There's a lot of other things I could say that aren't positive, but we'll stay in the positive space for a minute.
Sure, we're back in studio, which is crazy.
We're back in a studio.
And amazing to be here with you.
I'm
it's
sitting
very
across
special.
from people and looking at you as I'm speaking, and like we're drinking coffee together. So like, we're making some advances, and it's really nice to be able to do that with this version of the book. So, it's nice. It feels nice. It's a really good feeling. And, I'm leaving on Wednesday for kind of like a belated book tour, and it will all be paperback, which, and a lot of the events that we're planning are to support survivors of domestic violence, and a lot of women's clinics, and a lot of things that are very specific to women's health. And so those, there's an opportunity there to like throw a bunch of paperbacks into a women's center and like let them kind of move around in a really grassroots kind of way. So that's exciting too. I feel like this book is finding its community, and I think it's going to be because it made it to paperback, I think, by and large. So
yeah, it seemed like you really found this cool diverse audience when the book was first coming out. I remember you would be posting reactions from people, and they were from all over.
All over, yeah.
So and I want to talk a little bit about how you write a book with some like kind of Nashville insider stuff, and you talk about difficult relationships that you went through, chefs that you worked with. Then you have to go to the grocery store. Then you have to go to a movie.
Right.
And then you go to the cantina down the street where you just see your neighbors and see your community a little bit. And so you're running into these people, and you're having some of those in talking to you a few months back, having, kind of awkward situations but tell me about that versus it had to balance itself out really well with the feedback that's coming out to you from all over the world. That is people saying, oh my God, I have been waiting for someone to write this for so long. Right. That's what I feel like. So talk about that kind of juxtaposition, because I think that's interesting.
It is interesting, and it's not altogether easy to navigate. And it's easier for me to kind of put some language around it now than a year ago. But I think I had to sort of stay committed to what I know my intentions were, even though people, I think, will oftentimes try to assign you other intentions to your behavior or your decisions or your choices. And I think when you're making big decisions like this in the public eye, it feels important to kind of stay squared away with what you meant and accept that maybe you made some mistakes along the way and really stay in the space of what you were intending. And I never intended to actually suppose anything about anyone else. And I worked really hard to just communicate what I felt I had to navigate, and never really assigning any intent or any malice or any, nefarious, behavior towards me. I just really was trying to communicate something about my experiences that felt like I had to make decisions that I don't think I would have made if I hadn't obviously been presented with sort of these obstacles. And everyone has that, men, women, everyone has obstacles in their life where they feel like they have to make a decision that wasn't necessarily part of their plan. And I think women especially have to make those kinds of hard decisions. We have to constantly be navigating spaces where we're undervalued or seen in a certain light. And those realizations are difficult. And so I really, it's interesting to me that there was a little bit of a pushback. And I think, there have definitely been some relationships that have ended over this book. But ultimately, I know what my intentions were. I wish I maybe would have communicated a little bit better on the back end, but it was such an immersive project for me that I was in such a zone of writing this book that if I have one fault, it's that I didn't really consider communicating, I think, on the front end of this book with local people. And that's like a hard lesson. It's a really hard lesson to learn the hard way.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I know what my intention was. It was actually to bring some women into the public forum who I think don't often get to be as complicated and as complex as they are in real life, and also still be seen as incredibly valuable and to still be seen as really important. Because, oftentimes women are seen as complicated and difficult, and their value becomes less in a community because they're whatever, quote unquote, ball busters or, bitches or whatever the language is around women.
They're difficult. Yeah,
they're difficult instead of empowered or strong or focused or dedicated. And I was really, really trying to, and I honestly feel like I mostly succeeded because I get a lot of feedback saying, I really appreciate how you've put language around this, and I really appreciate how you've talked about these experiences. At the end of the day, I think a year after this book has been published, I've made peace with the fact that I think if you're going to put yourself in this sort of public arena, you're going to piss people off. And if there's any amount of honest reflection, it's not always going to come back and be perfect for everyone.
Yeah.
And and I do think I worked really hard to establish my boundaries as far as what I was willing to do. I was never trying to demean anyone in the public eye. So I really, really stuck wholly with what my experiences felt like without trying to sort of angle it in a victim lens or like anyone, did me any harm, with the exception of, obviously, there are several pages about domestic violence and in a really bad relationship. That obviously was something a lot more visceral and it is so far in my past that it was actually really therapeutic on some level for me to just go ahead and lay out the language and the honest, like the real raw honesty of that. And none of those people are in my life. And actually, frankly, I give a shit about what if they pick up this book. I think it would actually, I know it wouldn't affect their lives, but I don't care if it does or doesn't. The part that was surprising to me was how much this rubbed local people the wrong way. And so, balancing the sort of local blowback of this with the national and international sort of gratitude and thanks for kind of cultivating these stories on page has been interesting. Honestly, a lot of it I feel okay at this point, moving past at this point, and you can't get it right all the time, but you can always try to get it right the next time or closer to right the next time. And I'm, now I'm thinking through and forget the local community. This was incredibly difficult for my family. And so when people in Nashville say the 10 to 12 people who seem to have a problem with this book in Nashville, seem to feel like they are prioritized in my misgivings about how I wrote this book. My mother was the main priority. I spoke very carefully, but also very explicitly about the complications of being a woman my age with a mother her age. That's a very specific relationship that hasn't gotten a lot of space in the literary world yet. And I think there was so much value. I've done so many podcasts and book clubs with just women, and a lot of women either bring their mothers or their mothers bring their daughters. And they're all, this sort of Gen X and boomer mother. And it's this very complicated relationship. And so that becomes sort of my central focus. I actually, the sort of piddly weird shit that I'm supposed to be concerned about in Nashville is distracting. But the real heart of like what is upsetting, what could have been upsetting to me, was the impact this had on my mother. And but the beauty of it was we had this impactful 6 months after this book came out where there was some thrashing, there was some deep pain that got opened up, even though we thought we had talked about it, even though I called her researching this book, even though I included her in a lot of these sort of stories. There was some real deep things that we had to really, really get down to. And I can actually say our relationship now is so strong, like genuinely strong now. And she knows something about me, and I know something about her that we just didn't know before. That I think we were both sort of posturing our whole lives, trying to not get in each other's way. And this kind of forced so many issues of, we have to get in each other's way to actually be with each other and have these conversations that aren't easy. Yeah.
And I think that's like the power of writing, I think, too, is you get right down to it in a way that is hard to articulate, hard to talk to people about.
Well, I'm happy to hear the story of you and your mom continues past the book.
Yeah.
I think probably the one thing that gripped me the most about your book, at first, my first reaction was, oh my gosh, like, how wonderful, how honest. And I was like, Kenneth, you're gonna suck at being a literary critic because honesty is like it is a very large part of the story, but how your honesty is so relatable is really what gripped me about your book. And first of all, about haters, no matter what in the game, there's always going to be haters.
Yeah.
And in the context of writing, say, the Nashville food scene from 2002 until present day, if you hadn't written the book, you still would have had haters. And it probably would have possibly been the same ones that were pushing back on you about the book anyway. You just wouldn't have known how deeply they were.
Right.
They were.
Well, there's a lot of truth to that. There was a realization, and that's really, I think, an incredibly smart thing to acknowledge, because somewhere along the lines, I realized these people never respected me to begin with. So, why am I sitting here trying to mine for it now after the fact? So, you're absolutely correct. It's really smart observation, I think.
When you set out to write the book, it was a memoir to you, and were you like, I'm going, as deep as my writing will take me? Did you ever turn around and be like, wow, I'm like getting it all out there? Was that part of your goal? Like,
I imagine you had to bite your tongue a bit.
Did you map things out? Did you outline? Okay. So it was kind of the other way then.
Well,
maybe.
it was a large sort of dump, right? Like it was a large sort of, like, I got it all out, and then we reeled it in. And I said to my editors at some point, and they were good, because there was, on some level, about some people who are, not in my past and not my family that I spoke about, where it was just so, like, such an acerbic, like, bitterness that I would speak to them about. Like, I really wanted to I really wanted to say what I really think of them. And then I realized, well, what is the value of that? And does it undermine the actual power of sort of the
heart of what you're saying?
The heart of what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
does I started to feel like the things where I was obviously harboring some, not altogether like emotionally mature feelings towards some people, I realized all that's doing is deflecting the mission statement here, which is to show a through line of the ways in which women have to navigate their lives in this world, which was really, that was my first priority. And my second priority was then to show the ways in which women are tethered in a lot of these decisions and moves that they have to make. And even in distant relationships, and even in sort of random, interactions that might not matter to one person, but matter greatly to another person, I mean, talking about these sort of clandestine moments I had with Alice Randall is a great example, and they probably, maybe in some ways she didn't feel like there was a connection there, but they were really life-changing for me. And I really think there's something very special to showing that connectivity, especially amongst women, because we move in very quiet ways for each other. And I think there's something really powerful to that kind of storytelling. So yeah. It definitely, there was a lot of editorial guidance. There was a lot of me sort of deciding on the front end what my goals were and making sure that the only thing I wrote empowered those two kind of goals, which was, it was never going to be like, an expose of anybody. That was never. Yeah. And I don't think that's what it was, even though, some people behave as if it is. There was a really dedicated and conscientious effort to show only things from how I felt. And I think it was, made pretty clear throughout the book that this was about one woman's way of navigating most of her adult life.
Yeah. Now, I should have mentioned this in my epic intro, because you deserve an epic intro. You're a James Beard award-winning writer. I didn't mention that, but you won for an essay you wrote. Mm-hmm. Is that kind of, were you always going to write a book? Was that sort of what led to the book? And tell me about going from, because I know you love essays, and I know that's like part of your thing. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely like kind of essays within this book a little bit, I feel like. Like there was times where I was reading this book and I was like, I want to stay right here in this little world.
Yeah.
Where it was okay. And then it was because I knew it was going somewhere else. And I was like, I want to, it's like when you're watching a movie and you're like, let's stay right here for a second.
I was thinking of an exact part of the book that I I wanted to be in, which was the pizza place.
Trade Winds.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And your boss,
Tom Diufema.
Yes.
I'll say his name wherever I'm allowed to say
okay,
it.
Yeah, I fell in love with him.
He's
and the
incredible.
place all the way back to the office.
He was an incredible human, and I miss him nearly every day. What a guy. What a guy.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'm glad that you appreciated him.
No, thank you, Mike. I totally agree with you there.
I want to talk a little bit later about that sort of golden age of Nashville coming of age, early 2000s that you do talk about. But I guess what I was getting at was like, you love essays. I know that we share a love of Mary Frances, M.F.K. Fisher, and her writing and like her essays. But was it ever daunting for you to get into this book as you were writing it and you're going through it? Were you ever like, Jesus?
Yeah, every fucking day.
It was hard. And tell me about your process, because I feel like you were writing at home, and then I do remember going way back, like you would post on Instagram a little bit about you were writing something. I knew you were writing a book, but then I would see, I'd see you post, you're like in a hotel in the middle of nowhere in Louisiana, and you're like, I'm hunkering down and I'm writing. So tell me about that process that you went through of like, I need to go find somewhere to write, because I have kids, you have kids, we both know, and we've talked about, it's hard.
It's hard.
Yeah, but just tell me a little bit about that process and you finding that time to get away and what that gave to you as a writer and how you were able to carve out that time.
Well, going kind of back to the essay thing, I think the reason you feel like there are chunks of essays in this book is because there is. I mean, I can think of 3, the Massa chapter. I mean, there's
South of France a little bit.
There are definitely things that were written independently of this book. The Massa chapter is partially an essay I wrote that is now taught as like papers in universities. I mean, it was about being mixed race, having a mother, having a grandmother, losing those identities in the South, losing those identities in this country, purposefully, the erasure of, wanting to be less brown in this country to succeed, the realization that as much as that's heartbreaking and there's a real sense of loss to my person, the incredibly heartbreaking realization that my grandmother and my mother and my great-grandmother were right, and the less I looked like them, the better in this country. And so those conversations get a little distilled in essays, and they kind of get a little bit more stretched out in this book, to the point where I kind of wonder, looking back, I've talked to some other women who are mixed race who are like, I didn't quite feel the power of that. It could have been stronger. And so now I feel like, okay, so next time I really want to make sure the impact of what the essay is stays, because there's so much room in a book, and you can sort of bring more to it, but also you can water it down. So that as just like a writerly sort of thing I'm thinking about for the next time, of really just making sure that the power lines stay through each essay if they get embedded into a larger volume of work, a larger body of work. I did write most of this from home. I have a very small house with a lot of animals and a lot of grown people in it. My children are adults. And my son lives in New Orleans now, but at the time he was in and out. My husband is obviously a grown-ass man, and my daughter is now, 17 years old. And so we have a very small, one of these old East Nashville houses that, the walls are paper thin, and a dog and 3 cats. And, it's there's constant distraction. And I'm the only person in the house who does not have her own space to go close the door on. John has a studio out back, Maggie has a room, Joseph has a room, and then I'm sort of left here with no door to close. There wasn't even a door on our bedroom for the first year of me writing this book.
Yeah.
And
that'd be a good title for the next book, No Door to Close, with Lisa Donovan.
Yeah, I was like, I don't care what the door looks like, put it up. Put a door into this room. I need to close it. So it was difficult to find space, and I'm not a person that can write at a coffee shop or go to a place. I just
thank God.
I can't. I don't know how. Yeah,
libraries is the only place I've been able to kind of.
I still get distracted because I love a library so much that I find myself not able to just focus, because what I want to be doing is going into the archives and looking at old magazines, and I can't. I didn't realize how easily distracted I was until I was trying to write this book. But hotel rooms are great. And borrowing people's apartments when they go out of town. I was starting to be this weirdo who noticed when my friends were vacationing, and I was like, can I house sit for you? Can I just come? Do you have cats? I'll feed them. I just need to be alone. And I can't, something for me, and I have some other friends who are sculptors and not just writers, but I have some other friends who have children as well. The space for me isn't that hour. That space for me is like a week. I need to be in that space. So I need to start chewing on something on a Monday and then write it on a Friday. But it's a really ridiculous ask in all of our lives to only have that week to think about how to cultivate these ideas on paper. And a lot of writing, as you know, is not writing. So a lot of that is really just, and I do a lot of my pre-writing just in my head. And I'm thinking about, I just wrote a foreword for Phyla Hawes, for Carter Haw, just wrote Phyla Hawes' biography, and it's going to be a beautiful book. I think it's coming out next year. And I just wrote the foreword for it, and I read his book, and then I had to think about it for 2 weeks. I didn't take any notes on the book. I just thought, and I thought about the impact of Phyla on our community and the impact. And then when I sat down to write it, it all came out. But then I needed 2 more weeks to go back in and edit, and and then you're doing your copywriting process, and that's where the real work is. But the actual writing always feels like I just need some space. So I can copy edit at a coffee shop. I can copy edit at home with the dogs barking at the mailman. I can do all of that. It's that process before I actually get the stuff out on page that needs time and space and quiet and solitude. And solitude has become really important to me, which as a cook was never the thing. You were never alone. And all of a sudden now I have these really highfalutin expectations of being left to my writerly space. And it's kind of, part of me feels like it's ridiculous, but then part of me is that's the only way I can get it done ever. So I don't know what that means for the future, but I do recognize that that's what happened after 2.5 years of writing this book. Was I needed a lot of quiet and alone time and solitude to basically just be with myself and read other people's work too while I'm thinking about this. I mean, reading M.F.K. Fisher is always really good for me because she writes in a way that I will never be capable of, which is really economically and really tight. I've learned that there's this phrase called purple prose, which is probably an insult, but it's someone that actually writes in a way that you're moving through a cadence of their language, and I do that.
You definitely do.
Yeah. And so I see it as a strength because I feel like it's conversational, but I would love to spend more time in the copy editing phase and learning how to keep that cadence without being so, I don't know, too much, so it's sometimes those sentences are just too fucking much. So I hope and I project that I'll be writing a lot more in the future, and that's what this always was. And to go back to one of your questions, did I always know I was going to write a book? Yes. Did I know it was going to be this book? No. And it came from that one essay that kind of provided me the space to talk about a memoir. I actually thought, in my projection, I thought the reason I could except I have commitment issues with careers. But baking and cooking and being in the restaurant world was never going to keep me from writing. And so it was easy for me to dig into that space and write about food, and personal food narratives were just sort of coming into like the more common, not just Ruth Reichel purview of like magazines wanted to publish long form essays. SFA started publishing things. And so more space got created for that kind of thinking and writing. And because, this whole sort of movement happened, I wrote that essay in Food and Wine. It was a really genuine, visceral, and immediate reaction to a lot of things that I was seeing. And it was actually an email I sent to a very good friend, by and large. And it was one of those things where I was just really angry, and I wrote a letter to no one. And just was full of rage and fire. And I have 1,000 of these kinds of letters in my on my computer. If I ever die, people are gonna be like, oh my God, this fucking crazy bitch. But I get a lot of my feelings out in that way, and then I can be more useful. I don't run lukewarm. I'm very hot. I run very hot. And I so kind of doing that is a space for me to mitigate what is useful in the public arena. And that essay just sort of catapulted me into more space where I could kind of write a little bit more about this experience. And if I had, my plan was to write personal essay about food in a little bit more of a safe space, and then work my way into short story, and then move my way into fiction, long form fiction. Which, hopefully I'll have a long enough life to do that. But,
you got time. Plenty of time.
But did I think I was going to be writing something like this? No. But I'm glad I did, and I'm honored that I had the chance. And honestly, I think in some ways I needed to sort of deal with a lot of these things because they kept coming up. A lot of the topics in this book were showing themselves in other work, and I didn't necessarily want that. So now they're managed, they're dealt with, and I can really truly like move forward and think about what else I want to write and say.
That actually sounds like good advice to a writer to like email your best friend a bunch of really intense thoughts. So when they're there, but really also just to write when the idea is there, when the passion's there, when the fire's there. It seems like you're really good at doing that. But about your process, what it sounds like too is that you're like sitting there watching the clouds form and figuring out like what shape they're going to take and really like ruminating and then you're like, it's go time.
That's it.
Motherfuckers.
Allow me to speculate.
This is a new segment. Allow Kenneth to speculate.
No. In all seriousness, the book is somewhat chronological, right?
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem like it was all. It was obviously not written chronologically. So, to borrow from Mike's point, there were these points. It seems like that you definitely wanted to put into the book. They were very important. They were the backbone of the book.
Yeah.
But everything in between possibly just kind of came up as you developed those more your mainstream themes or what have you.
Absolutely.
Like, everything else kind of fell together.
There definitely was a body, an outline that we kind of developed after I kind of dumped a lot of those impassioned treaties on my editors. And they were like, okay, we need to mark this and we need to, and you're right, Kenneth, it was really like, for me, I think they would have been comfortable with a little bit more of a creative approach to the timeline. But really, truly, there was a lot of work, emotional labor that went into this book. And I couldn't really take any more of myself to figure out like what could have been a more interesting structure. So it kind of came chronologically and was outlined chronologically, but you're absolutely right. It wasn't written that way. A lot of these chapters were written in of themselves, and transitioning them together and binding them together was hopefully something we did, mostly without noticing, but also it was a little bit of like a knitting project of making sure this tied in with this. And
Sure.
man, I tell you, like, copy editors are geniuses, you know. And I really enjoyed the copy editing process. Because that was the closest that I had felt to the same kind of satisfaction I get like in a pastry kitchen. It's incredibly technical and it's really satisfying
Yeah.
to be able to go in and chop and cut and move and think through like the architecture of something was really satisfying for me. So now that I know I've never had to write obviously a book before, but now I know, and I have permission from myself to be messy, because I know it's, not to make, I hate dumb metaphors, but like it, I can remember whenever I was first baking, and I remember worrying. I used to make these huge layer cakes at City House, and I would get really worried for Sunday supper, and I would make these layer cakes and I'd be so excited. But there's a process that looks really bad when you're making a layer cake. And there's something called a crumb coat, right? Like where you look like you've just made a disaster of a cake, because you just have messy crumbs everywhere, and your frosting is full of things, and it's half iced. But that's a really important stage. And then you go and you put that cake in the fridge and let it kind of firm up so that you can then apply a more beautiful layer and whatever. Like, I'm not a big cake decorator, but if you're going to do that, like, then there's 3 more steps. And so it felt like the same thing I realized when, like, I literally would walk through the kitchen as I was taking it to the walk-in being like, it's just the crumb coat, because I was so worried someone was going to think, because that's what you do when you're a beginner. You just you don't want to look like you don't know what you're doing, so you try to perfect it right there, so that the only thing people see is the best of what you've done. And you can't do that. The process is messy, and you have to be willing to let people see that, like editors and your co-cooks and chefs and your sous chefs and like the people around you. And that's a beginner's problem, right? Like realizing that, like, you don't have to feel insecure about how messy the cake looks in the crumb coat phase, because it's not done. Yeah. And it's the same with writing, and you just got to be ugly and messy and get it out, get the words on the page, because the beauty and the real craft of writing and the real skill of writing is going back in and figuring out where everything needs to be and if it needs to be. And then you have something that you can put in front of people. But doing that with editors in a very big publishing house like Penguin Press was terrifying for the first 6 months. And I'm not altogether like an incredibly trusting person. So I'm like, no, I'm going to wait. And I kept waiting.
And you're sending them your life.
Yeah. And and so I kept waiting until it was presentable. And finally, my editor, God bless her, she's a dear woman, and I don't know what I would do without her. She was like, knock it off. I need to see it all. I need to see the mess, so that we know where we're mining for gold. Like, we got to see it all. Yeah. So that's a really, that's a very basic thing. I'm not a pedigreed writer, I went to community college, like, I write because it is something inside of me, but I'm not altogether like, I didn't go to Brown and get an M.F.K, I mean, I am learning so much about this process in real time, which is apparently how I do everything. And it seems like the hard way, but it's really the only way that's ever been accessible to me. And so, it takes some time, obviously, but I think it takes time regardless of how you do it. And I've just been really fortunate to find myself around people that communicate honestly and are dedicated to me being a better writer every time. So
that's a great essay too. The crumb layer. Yeah. Have you written that essay yet?
No, but I should.
That's good. That's good stuff. And I agree that I think that a lot of times the most enjoyable phase of putting a book together is that like final kind of sculpting stage where you're like, I could do this forever. Yeah. Just like making it a little bit better every time, because it's like you spend an hour.
Yeah. There's some danger in there too, though.
Sure. And I feel like you talk about metaphors. I feel like there's a whiskey metaphor in there of like where you were talking about like well, I don't want to water it down too much, but like I do want to. It's just like it's like proofing whiskey. You know, it's like you can add. You need more water. Yeah. You always need, you know, from where it comes out of the barrel. You almost always need a little water to really know what you have. But if you go too far, then you just have watered down shit. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I think that there's a good metaphor there too.
Yeah, interesting.
But you have to trust the person adding the water.
Right.
And the person tasting it that says it needs more water.
Yeah.
Because you might not want more water in there, Mike.
Yeah.
You might like it as it is. But then this guy who waters down whiskey all day,
right,
every day for a living, he has a different opinion than you.
Yeah, and he's not just doing it for me. He's doing it for
everyone.
Yeah.
The collective.
Yeah. That's why you end up with like the geniuses and masters of Old Medley and Wathans. Why Old Medley 12 years, 86.9 proof or something like that? 87.4.
Sure.
And it's like always going to be that proof because they've perfected it over years. I don't think anyone ever does that with writing, but maybe. I don't know. Maybe Lisa probably will eventually once she's on book number 8. Do you know where you're going next? And I don't. Yeah. Do you know what is next for you? Is there going to be some fiction? You've posted before about maybe like a screenplay, or but yeah, what's next for you for writing?
You know, I think I will be working on things like short stories and screenplays, and I think there's space for people to break out of their niche, but I haven't reached that place yet, you know. It's interesting in our culture how incredibly small people want you to stay. And I'm struggling a little bit with that, of like staying in my lane, you know, and being this chef writer. I had sort of a bit of a personal like thrashing about this year where I just don't, I kept saying to myself, I don't want to write about restaurants anymore, or ever. I never did, honestly. And I, especially with sort of the petty, weird, small town shit that kind of kicked up from this book, was like, I absolutely don't want to keep revisiting these spaces that felt really important to me, that feel complicated now. But I really had to turn it around, and I went to New Orleans. You know, a friend of mine has an apartment there that she is not staying in because she just is, you know, she's bought a home, and so she's in this transition, and I can borrow her apartment. And I just stayed there. I was supposed to stay there for a whole month, but the hurricane came, and
oh dang, that's right.
Yeah. So, but I was there for 2.5 weeks, and I got that solitude, and I got that that quiet, and I really went down with the intention of getting my head back around writing about food. And it occurred to me, and I realized I can still do this work, and it doesn't have to be about restaurants. You know, I've been so frustrated by restaurants for so long, and the culture that they kind of stain like food, what I consider true food culture. So I went down to New Orleans, and I think I got there. I think I re-arrived at a space where I fell back in love with food separately from my experiences in restaurants. And that being said, you know, I've been doing some consulting work in Savannah with Mashama Bailey and Jono Marsano, and they've built a beautiful kitchen. And I'm all of a sudden working with these young cooks who are earnest and good, and unlike a lot of things I've seen, and are dedicated to learning. There's like a new, in this kitchen anyway, there's like a new crop of young cooks coming up that I think know the score. I think restaurant owners are meeting them where they are, at least in this restaurant. And there's something really inspiring happening in that kitchen, of these young cooks who have come to Mashama Bailey's kitchen to learn about how she has built her life. And so you know, as much as like, and that was just, you know, me going to New Orleans to try to sort of wash that man right out of my hair about restaurants. it's really funny to me that the second I kind of got squared away with that in my writing space, I ended up just a couple of weeks later finding myself in a kitchen that I was emotionally inspired by, and meeting especially these young women in these kitchens that are just fucking go-getters and like dedicated and like bright-eyed, and there's no yes chef bullshit. There's no there's like there's some real truth to what she's doing in these kitchens. And so it's funny to me that I cleared all this space, and now I'm finding myself again in kitchens, in a restaurant kitchen, where I can like have conversations about the professional aspect of food, which I thought I was trying to get away from. So I'm in this interesting transition. I think I'll be writing about food for some time. I hope I get more chances to write about food. It'll be probably a little less personal. I mean, it'll still be personal. I write things from a personal space always. But I really am writing a lot about food, and I mean the texture of food and the beauty of food and the actual sort of tactile nature and sensations of food. And so I'm kind of getting back in that space of really like identifying what's beautiful, not about the idea of food or the community of food, but really talking about food again. So that's exciting.
Yeah, that's a thing I feel like anyone can go back to M.F.K. Fisher's work for stuff like that, because she can turn a lunch with her daughter
completely
in a town she doesn't really know much about and may not even know much about the food, but she's going to talk about this lunch like it was the most important day of the year, and it probably was.
Yeah.
So I feel like you're the new M.F.K. Fisher, so congratulations.
Take it. That makes more sense. I don't know. That feels truer than Beyonce. But I mean, only because I want it. Only because that would be an incredible, lineage to follow. And it's definitely, her work definitely is a big inspiration for me. And, if you've read this book, you'll see like she had an impact many times on not just my work, but like my personal sort of identity in a lot of ways. So
yeah, and we share that a little bit just because it was her book, A Cordial Water, which really made me feel like I could do a book on the stuff that I was doing or stuff I had done, where I couldn't really see what a book like that would be. But when I read hers, it was just like, oh, well, you just talk about what's really in your heart and what you're passionate about and what you love about all these different maybe plants or drinks or whatever. She sort of lets you know that there's no like roadmap.
Right. Well, and she's really good. Yeah. She's really also good at speaking to what's right in front of you. And sometimes that's enough.
Yeah.
Sometimes that becomes, sometimes that becomes kind of like going or reading your horoscope, where if you say what's just enough, you're giving people space to imbue their own need from just a conversation about a peach,
Yeah.
And if you kind of give people some space in your writing to find themselves, I think that's a real beautiful gift. And she was masterful at it. So I'm kind of practicing getting out of the way a little bit, and the words. And that it feels great because this book was was just every ounce of me, like to the point where like I felt like I had to sort of reclaim a lot of myself after I went through this process. And so now it feels really freeing and exciting to be treating the work of writing with a little bit more distance and finding some power in that distance. We'll see if I succeed. But
reading Our Lady of Perpetual Hunger, the book we're talking about today, Lisa Donovan's masterpiece of a memoir that is recently in paperback, and you can find all over Nashville and wherever you buy books. One thing I learned in it is like Lisa has spent a lot of time in the front of house as well. So I feel like you really understand like the role of the front of house and the differences between being front of house and back of house, and the differences between even, being the pastry chef as opposed to being more like a chef, which you did with the Buttermilk Road stuff. So you have all these different like experiences, but a lot of your experiences as a server, or is there a different, or are they calling it something different now than servers? No. I'm learning. I'm learning every day. There's new terms for everything, which is good. But this was like Nashville, early 2000s. It was, I know people in my neighborhood and people I've talked to, even Kenneth right here. It's like this golden age of Nashville. The Titans coming to town. Yeah, speak a little bit about that.
Basically, every year before you got here. Just kidding.
Wow.
Just kidding.
Blooper reel.
Titans.
But yeah, y'all talk about what was so special about that time, and Margot was the restaurant was really sort of a leading light in the restaurant world changing and all that time period.
What do you got, Kenneth?
I don't know. He brought up Margot, and I promised I would not bring up Margot. Margot's going on 20 years now, right?
Yeah,
is that correct?
Incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
An old gas station that my father used to work at.
I mean, It's a seminal restaurant. Like, it is important. And it was the first place I ever walked into where I realized this is a profession. This isn't a transitory job. Like, I hope that I was clear about the relevance of that in the book. And it was the first place that I saw all of these weird, that at the time felt really weird. Like, I didn't have any friends that cared about food. I mean, I think one of the quotes from the book is like, all of my friends were like tragically skinny yogi people that smoked a lot of cigarettes. They didn't do yoga for health. They did it to be thin. And I was literally like 2 kids, little chubby all the time, like making food, eating food, talking about food, trying to figure out where to get good food. And no one was really interested in my world, and I did these, I outside of Trade Winds, like Trade Winds was definitely sort of this novelty experience where it felt more like I was in love with, Tom and the thing he built specifically than necessarily the food, even though that's when my baking started. And that's when I started, but I didn't, it was still like a means to an end, right? Like, I'm going to do this until I can be a curator or a art conservator or whatever it is I was trying to do before my real life happened. And then we moved to Nashville and things just started to move in a very specific direction that was always about food. And walking into Margot Cafe and Bar was the first time I realized, like, this is a job. Like, this isn't just a job so that I can make $78 a night or $150 a night at Jackson's or whatever. This is a job that if I show up and learn and am ready, she will teach me and I will learn. And it was hard and complicated. And the beauty, I think, for me in someone like Margot is that she was the first person I had ever met that simply was unapologetic about her expectations. And that was hopefully what I wrote and said in the book. I think a lot of people mistook what I was saying about Margot somehow in the book, but it doesn't matter. What I really wanted to show about someone like Margot is that in 2000, and I think I started working for her in 2005, and to realize that she had only been open for 2 years, I think, at that point. And how much she had already established an incredibly high bar for our service, for the wine service, for learning, for what I needed to know as a server was remarkable to me. And it was the first time I'd ever seen anything like it. So I think, her value can't be understated in this community. I don't think we'd have a lot of what we have.
Yeah, well, and you seemed, when I first started working with you, and I had already known you a little bit through Joy Shaw, so I kind of knew you as a person before we started working together. But I feel like you always were kind of more of a uniter and an empathizer with the whatever folks were going on in the front of the house as well.
Yeah.
So it was cool reading that part of the book and knowing where that came from. It came from actually being there. But what I feel like you've had so many experiences in the restaurant world and in the culture of a restaurant. But being back now in the kitchen, you talked a little bit about how you felt like some things have changed and you're seeing like maybe some different attitudes. What do you see? Do you see that this is like a momentary kind of blip as far as restaurant culture is changing, or do you see this as more of a long-term thing?
I mean, I see a very bifurcated thing happening. I see my friends who own restaurants literally killing themselves to try to make it like a situation that is better than it has ever been, that where they can still accomplish the vision of a restaurant and what a restaurant is. They are struggling greatly in finding people who are interested in this line of work anymore, and that's not good reason, you know. And so I see this one angle where I have friends who are dedicated to, you know, bringing restaurants into a space that can be career paths and sustainable career paths and respectable career paths and career paths where we, you know, get dental insurance and time off and, you know, and are considered as professionals in our field. I mean, what two of my best girlfriends, you know, one of them, you know, was a career bartender and just left. You know, it was during the pandemic, but she was on her way out anyway. And, you know, she's working at, she's working at Warby Parker now as one of their like top sales people online. And,
nice.
And she is perpetually shocked at the basic civility of a job like that. And one of my other best friends is a career server, and she's been out in San Francisco for the last 12 years. And the struggles just never seem to go away. It's always the same struggle. And, you know, we're in our 40s now. We're grown-ass women. And it's like, you know, it would be really incredible to be having some different conversations. However, I have chef owner friends who have a whole different set of challenges on their end. And so seeing how that's going to play out, I think there's good intention. And I think there are people who are dedicated to hospitality that will figure out ways in which we can make this work. But then I'm just skeptical of this country in general at this point, and have been for some time. And I just wonder if the bigger picture does not allow us to do what is actually needed to take care of each other. And that's where it's bifurcated, because I see people trying to do the work and trying to make it happen and trying to turn the engine over. And I just feel like we live in a country where that's going to increasingly become more impossible.
Fuck.
Yeah, that's like the text that Kenneth and I have been sending to each other more often in the past year, like Canada. Just text.
I know.
The west side of Canada, bro. I'm there. Yeah. And I'll say, now Costa Rica would be much nicer. And then he's like, maybe Quebec? Montreal? I don't see you in Montreal, though. We talk about Canada a lot, but neither one of us can
kept on imagining like Trudeau would buy a Caribbean island, and
right,
and that would be
right. Yeah, that's your solution.
That would be where we would defect to.
Should we booze news?
I still wanted to stay on the same point that Lisa was talking about. It seems like, first of all, I want to compliment you on how you don't say, or at least not today, Lisa, you don't say the restaurant industry. And that's big to me, because like to say the word industry is to make it industrial. It's just not like it's impersonal, and
it is. Yeah,
it's a gross misrepresentation of restaurants or restauranting. But the trajectory of it this year, coming out of the pandemic, has been very hard to navigate. It seems like every other week, the restaurants that we concern ourselves with just goes in completely different directions, only to come back to another, maybe possibly brilliant or great headspace to be in, only to go back another way. And these are both exciting, as in we don't know how things are going to turn out times, but also incredibly frustrating because we have a lot of these same problems that kind of just push straight through the pandemic and continue with at full steam, the same amount of momentum that they had prior to the pandemic. I'm not speaking of anything specific.
Well, there's certainly hope in the challenges, right? It's harder and harder to stay in that space. And I can remember last year talking to, there's an incredible high school in New York that is training high school students to work in the hospitality space, whether it's restaurants or hotels or whatever. And they're learning hospitality business. They're learning front of the house, back of the house. Some of them are chef-led. Some of them are, business-led. And every year they have a speaker come, or maybe every semester or quarter or whatever it may be. But they had me come and speak to them just about sort of, these poor kids. These are graduating high school students. And this was, last October when restaurants were dying. We're gone. We're done.
In trouble.
There, PPP was just a straw everyone was trying to, grasp at, and we had no idea if we were going to survive as a culture and what it was going to look like this time now, right? Like this time next year, which is now. And these kids were like, holy shit, are we going to have, what do we do? We're 18 years old. We are trained up for this, and this doesn't exist anymore. And even though it continued to exist, it doesn't exist in the same way that they were expecting, which I think is good in some ways, and in some ways is terrifying for them. And I said to them, I said, look, the only thing I can really tell you and give you right now is that you have an opportunity. And it feels less, I feel, my hope waxes and wanes sometimes, and I try to stay optimistic. Again, it gets harder and harder sometimes. But back then I was really clinging to sort of this optimism of, we have a moment, there's hope in the challenge. And you have an opportunity that none of us had, which is that, the plane has been grounded. It's in the shop. It's not, we've been trying to fix it mid-flight, and you guys have it now in the garage, and you can take it apart, put it back together so that it works better for what you guys need. And I think the thing you guys need to be doing as careerists in this field is talking to people who have been doing this for 20 years and ask us, where did it go wrong? How come it wasn't more solvent in a moment like this? How come we're all 6 weeks away from just absolute failure and destruction and that is not a business model. It's just simply not to even mention how you support your employees. So back it all the way up to, how do you build restaurants again where they can either be small enough to sustain just a small group of people, and if you are going to get large enough, what does that actually look like so that it is not exploitive of everyone except for the top dollar? You guys have a chance to take all those pieces apart and figure out how they can reasonably be put back together. And, in my estimation, it's the former. We just make this back to a non-industry, and we make this back into a space where restaurants is a person feeding another person and employing 3 people to help feed those people. And that's not big business, and that's not a capitalist mindset. But Jesus fucking Christ, how many millionaires do we need? And I don't know a lot of real cooks. I mean, that's not true. Something changed along the lines where 10 years ago, people thought getting into food was going to make you rich and famous, because it sometimes does, right? And I've had so many people say to me, literally just 3 days ago, I thought you were rich. I mean, by the way, who says that to people? Fuck off. And no, I've been raising 2 kids for 22 years, and I'm very worker class, and I'm not a celebrity. I don't have a PR company. I don't have the things that I think people think you have. And there's this strange expectation of what it means to be a quote unquote chef in this world, you know, and part of the understanding of that needs to change now. You know, like I live in a very modest, you know, 900 square foot house that I was lucky enough to be able to purchase with my husband almost 10 years ago. We couldn't do that right now in Nashville, you know, I mean, and it's so bizarre to me what people think of other people's lives. Yeah. And there's a real strange misconception about what work in the food industry can bring you. And I do, you know, put myself in the public eye because it's important to my writing. And I want to find myself in situations like I just found myself in where I'm like mentoring young cooks. That's really important to me. If I can, you know, there's a really incredible pastry cook there named Sam, and she's fucking badass, and she's just ready to go. And if I can somehow figure out how to give her my years of experience to make sure she doesn't have to obstacle the way I did or whatever, she's going to have her own challenges, but I can at least give her some great recipes and give her some good guidance and be there while she goes through this, so that by the time she's 44 and maybe has 2 kids, she has things a little bit more locked down, you know? And I don't know. So there's, you know.
Well, and she doesn't need to feel self-conscious about walking that layer cake back.
Exactly.
And
right?
That seems like it could be a really small thing, right? But maybe it's not.
It's not.
It's part of like believing in yourself, and that's a big thing that mentors can do. You know, and if that's not a small thing. That's a huge thing.
It's a huge thing.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right, and the time has come for chow chow chow. Booze News with Kenneth Deadman. Dun, 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 dun. Booze News. Don't edit this part out, Mike.
We'll start off with something easy.
What's going on? What's booze-worthy out there?
Well, Mike, Nicolas Cage got drunk in Las Vegas last week.
Oh, I love the beginning of that.
A strong start.
Yes.
Moving on. In whiskey news, Peyton Manning's Sweet Cove is set to release, I believe, this week. Marianne Eaves, who formerly Marianne Barnes, formerly master distiller at Castle and Key, who we're huge fans of.
Sure.
Of whom we are huge fans.
I like the way that sounds. But I also use the word amongst, which apparently is pretentious. So don't listen to me.
The brand Sweet Cove, conceived by Peyton Manning amongst fellow golf players.
Well done.
Yeah.
Named after a nine-hole executive golf course near South Pittsburgh, Tennessee. Likely sourced from George Dickel.
Okay. Yeah.
Sweet Cove will premiere at a $190 per liter price tag.
Wow.
Which is also about the same price as 9 holes at Sweet Cove Golf Course.
Interesting.
Okay.
Have you tasted any of it yet?
No.
Okay.
No. I believe they're just now making the rounds, and I'm pretty sure it's all on Broadway by now anyway.
Shout out Marianne Eaves. She knows what she's doing, and she's really talented in the distilling world. So
brilliant. She's brilliant.
It's cool that she's on board with Manning and Co., I guess.
They paid her.
Yeah, that's cool.
Move on.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah. What else is going on?
It also in whiskey news. I wonder, do y'all ever read a news story, maybe interested in the tagline, the title, but then there's just a very odd fact that never belonged in the story.
Sure.
In this case, the Buffalo Bills, the NFL football team, Buffalo, New York, has named Screwball Whiskey a peanut butter flavored whiskey as their official whiskey sponsor. Available exclusively in the Buffalo Bills football stadium this season.
Wow.
The brand is owned by California bartender Stephen Young.
I met him 2 years ago.
Yeah?
when he was making the rounds with the peanut butter whiskey. It's good.
Cambodian refugee. That's very interesting. Him and his wife, Brittany, conceived the brand. Brittany's a chemist and an attorney, which I think is probably very important if you're starting a whiskey brand. Now, bevindustry.com, when releasing this press release, and congratulations to Stephen, pointed out he was a California bartender, a Cambodian refugee, polio survivor.
Been through a lot.
But his wife, chemist, attorney.
Chemist, attorney, yeah. Owns his ass.
Anyway. It was a rough boot.
Anything else?
105-year-old Lucia DeClark of New Jersey overcame COVID, having had her second Pfizer shot. Breakthrough case. Have y'all heard of? Do y'all have a lot of friends that have breakthrough cases?
Handful.
Yeah, handful too.
Yeah.
I think I've had more than a handful.
They've been pretty mild though, yeah? For
Yeah.
you guys as well? Your
Yeah.
friends? Yeah.
Yeah. No one in a bad
No.
bad situation.
Kind of just like a rough cold.
Couple days.
Yep.
Couple days. 105-year-old Lucia
Dang.
got a breakthrough case. Family very worried. Pulled through okay. Her secret, every day she eats 9 golden raisins that have been soaked in gin.
Oh!
For 9 days. Apparently, Lucia has a revolving jar of golden raisin infusion, gin infusion, that she eats every morning, along with fresh aloe juice, before she brushes her teeth with baking soda.
That's the secret. And I feel like our listeners at home and abroad who create cocktails, we've got plenty of those listeners out there. They create cocktails. They're beverage people. They're bartenders. This is a good story that they could reference for, maybe a cool drink. They could take some golden raisins, soak them in gin, do like a fall Martinez riff, and reference this story.
Call it the Lucky Lucia.
Lucky Oh, yes.
Here we go.
That's why we got Lisa in here. All right.
All right. Here we go. Oklahoma resident Andrew Erickson, 24 years old, has pled guilty for protesting inside the Capitol building on January the 6th. This fucker. Andrew is probably most well known of the 650 that have been arrested so far as the guy that took the beer out of Nancy Pelosi's mini fridge.
Yeah.
Andrew
What's
posted,
she doing with one beer in there anyway? I feel like she needs at least a 6-pack for these times.
Do you know what kind of beer it was?
I feel like it was like a Bud Light or something, but
It was a light beer.
Miller Lite.
You're actually closer than he was.
Coors Light.
Y'all are still close, but not there. Let's go south of the border. It's Corona Light.
Oh.
Wow.
Which has a much lower gluten content than either of the beers y'all mentioned. If it even has a gluten content.
It's a chugger.
It's a chugger.
Yeah.
So in the plea deal, Andrew had to admit to taking the beer. He wasn't convicted of stealing a beer. But part of his plea deal was he had to admit to taking Nancy Pelosi's beer.
Did that reduce his sentence somehow?
He hasn't been sentenced yet. Of the 615 that have been arrested for protesting inside the Capitol, which is the charge that they're all facing right now, is protesting inside the Capitol.
Looked like breaking and entering to me, but okay.
Of the 615, 75, including Andrew, have pled guilty.
What a world. All right, I look forward to a follow-up report on this gentleman's sentencing for taking the Corona Light.
Yeah.
Thanks for the detail on the beer.
All right, that's booze news.
Nice. The first live booze news in 18 months. I don't know. It's been a
So
while.
glad I was here for it.
So great. Since we have famed pastry chef, James Beard Award-winning writer, the Beyonce of buttermilk pie, here in studio, we talked a little bit about this peanut butter whiskey, which would be a great whiskey to bake with, honestly. It would be really cool to make some cool desserts with that. But talk to me a little bit about your skill and your, it's back there. The way that you have used booze in baking and some of your favorites to use, and maybe like what are you looking for when you smell like a rum or you smell a brandy, or is it just a matter of, well, I'm going to cook out most of the booze here, so I'm just looking for, is there some vanilla coming through? Like, what are you looking for? What are some applications that you like with booze and baking?
Well, I think I might be opposed to a peanut butter whiskey, not in general, just in baking, because I think I would prefer, I'm pretty much, and I'm realizing that this is so much more of like apparently like a personal treatise than I realized. But as I'm talking to these young cooks, I realize I actually don't like a lot of unnecessary roadblocks to one particular, like highlighting one particular flavor. So if you know, and sometimes I don't like to cook out the alcohol. Sometimes the alcohol is the feeling that I want. Sometimes I want a little bit of like a deeper feeling of that alcohol to play off of, you know, fruit. Sometimes that's really nice. But, or butterscotch pudding. Sometimes you kind of want that. Like you want to feel like you're having, or like a figgy pudding, or like a baked steamed pudding, or something like that. Sometimes you really want to have that sensation of festivity and, you know, celebration, and, you know, alcohol does that. If I'm looking purely for like flavor addition, I typically like to use rum. I think rum has something really special to it where you almost don't recognize that it's rum because it plays really well with like citrus flavors and vanilla. And whereas with whiskey and bourbon and rye and things, it's kind of always clearly, especially if you're not burning off the alcohol. But even when you do burn off the alcohol, you're still dealing with a little bit of, and maybe you guys can tell me what this is from, but there's like, you know, there's an earthiness that you can't quite, and I don't know if that's because it's in barrels or what, but there's something to bourbon and whiskey and rye and that sort of outside of rum, the brown liquor space that kind of imparts like a depth, and it just sort of creates a whole nother level. With rum, I feel like you can actually let it bring other flavors up. And I'm talking about not a spiced rum or a white rum even, but that nice kind of rich, good sipping rum.
Sure.
You know?
Like an aged rum,
Like a really pretty aged sipping rum really is, I think, one of the most beautiful things that you can add to a baked product, any kind. And you know, of course, like cordials, you and I did a lot of like cordial work together. And I think those are pretty accessories, you know. I think they get lost if you add them to actually like the body of something. But I like the idea of using things as an accessory. I can remember whenever, what's that really pretty Lillet? Remember when everyone was super excited about Lillet, like in 2004 or something like that? Lillet was like a really pretty one that you could just almost kind of drizzle on like a gelato or a sorbetto or something like that, you know. And
it's like so light.
It's so light, and it's sweet.
Bright.
It's bright. It's sweet enough. It's its own little thing. I don't necessarily do so much of that anymore. I'm so much dedicated to now just bringing out the simplicity of everything that, like, you know, one of the cooks I was working with in Savannah was trying to do something with like a ricotta panna cotta, and she was burying it under a bunch of shit. And I was like, look, the whole point here, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, but you want people to taste how hard you worked at making this beautiful ricotta. Have like, this is the center stage item, right? So like, why would you bury it with a bunch of shit that you're just drowning out that ricotta flavor? And so now I'm kind of working in a really editorial way where unless I want the alcohol to be the, you know, again, like a rich steamed pudding or something like that, you know, I use a little bit of rum just to kick up sort of the depths of what vanilla can do, or the depths of what orange can do.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and I imagine it's like the grain in whiskey maybe that
maybe
like you can't really get away from.
It's a emulsifying agent in the whiskey and the rum. It's called hemicellulose.
Oh, okay. And
especially if you're specifically mentioning vanilla and how it ties to a vanilla, that sounds about right to me.
Well, and rum's cool because you get different flavor profiles and such different rums from all the different countries it comes from. Whereas like whiskey, and you know, especially if you're cooking it down, it's not going to change that much. Like Scotch is definitely different than American bourbon for sure. But if you're talking rum, even in the Caribbean, you have your Cuban style, which has like the honey and vanilla. You have your Jamaican style, which has like heavy, pungent banana funk. Then you have your rum agricoles from Martinique. Totally different. Lemongrass, herbaceous things. Right? So there's all these different things to pull from. So I think that's fascinating.
I think there's so much more nuance to rum. I don't, and you guys, like I actually could talk about this for another 2 hours because I'm so curious. And I feel like there's something about rum that this is me being like really bullshitty esoteric about baking. I always try, baking for me is really like, I always attribute it to sort of like human interaction. But like, I feel like rum makes sense simply because of what it's made of. To sure, like it feels like less of a disruption, and I don't know in my very rudimentary booze knowledge, I guess there's a part of me and my very basic understanding of things where it's like, well, of course it feels right. It's made from cane. It's made from this like say there's similar, maybe similar, but that's probably completely false. It feels like a more familiar thing to introduce to something that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, for sure.
So I love it. I love baking with rum, and also I had to stop using a lot of whiskey and rye and bourbon because I have a very unfortunate condition, so that I can't, which is interrupted a lot of my baking world, and I'm trying to get back to learning how to bake with the inability to have wheat strains in any of my products. So that's an interesting change, and it's a new challenge. But it's not actually a new challenge. It's a new challenge I'm willing to finally admit. So,
well, are you celiac?
It is. It's okay. Yes. It's really difficult for me to admit, but like I have been marking as celiac. I got diagnosed with Hashimoto's some time ago, and basically all of the warnings were like, if you mind your manners, you can avoid other autoimmune disorders. And I was like, mind my manners? Who the fuck you think you're talking to? And I proceeded to eat and drink and do whatever I wanted and get sicker and sicker. And so now I'm definitely marking with this issue. And it's a challenge as a baker to have. It's a challenge I now have to finally accept that I was in denial about for about 7 years. And I kept trying to sort of mitigate it. But now it's like, well, I have to sort of accept that this is a real limitation, but also an opportunity. And I can start to find other things and, relearn a lot of baking, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. But I think that's also a lot of the reason why I'm like attaching myself to this idea of rum, I think too, just because I've always used it, but now I almost solely use it whenever I'm trying to add that sort of richness to or layers of baking.
What's an ingredient that you feel like if you walk in, you're coming into, a kitchen in Savannah, you're gonna help out, you're gonna consult a little bit. What's an ingredient that you feel like you see it and you're like, oh, there's my old friend? Or, is there a flour that's really specific for you? Is there a salt that you feel like this, using this salt is super crucial? Is there a sugar that you feel like people should know about? Is it the buttermilk?
Broadly, I'm always most excited about the fruit that I see. Like I always gravitate towards the fruit. Like whatever fruit is available, that's what I will fixate on. And then I think the next thing I get excited about is butter and dairy. And I get really excited about it. I know my preferences in butter, and I know my preferences in buttermilk in particular, but I love walking into strangers' kitchens and seeing what their dairy larder looks like, it's different based on where you go, and going into San Francisco, buttermilk is not a popular thing, and people have instead a lot of like fermented like kefir yogurts and things that are like goat's milks, and things that are very different than the things we gravitate towards in the South. So that kind of becomes something really interesting to me. and I know what I like, but I like more getting to use products I haven't seen before. And, you know, I was executing a dessert for a very big, important event that I wasn't willing to fuck up or experiment on when I was out in San Francisco, and I really wanted buttermilk. I was being presented with all these other options, and I was like, I really need buttermilk.
Yeah.
And a chef friend of mine who lives out there, he took me to like this sort of Ukrainian market, this Russian Ukrainian market, and they had this beautiful Ukrainian buttermilk.
Whoa.
And it was rich and beautiful, and it was very similar, if not, I mean, it was just different. It wasn't better, but it was exciting in its differences from the Cruze's buttermilk that I always use here, which I think is the perfect buttermilk. And like that, if I walk in and see Cruze's buttermilk, I'm like, hey,
yeah,
like that's the one that I'm like, yes,
yeah,
great. I can do 5,000 things with you.
That was when I realized you can just drink buttermilk.
Right.
I'd never considered that until tasting that stuff.
It's
and I was
really great. And I really appreciate how unwilling they have been to get as big as they could have gotten. You know, like they're like, it can only be this good at this scale. And I really value that. So I think that's
so opposite of just anything
everybody else,
food related. Yeah, like you can't grow. You can't grow.
Yeah.
Well, then you're dying. You know, it's like, well, no, not necessarily. This is just what we do.
Yeah.
Is there a butter that we need to know about that maybe we don't know about? Is there like a butter out there that we're just, are we missing out on life? I don't want to miss out on butter.
You know, I mean, if you can get like, you know, butter made in France, you're doing great. But also, I mean, I don't really like to be too elitist in my baking practices. And I really would prefer to make it accessible to everyone. And I think the thing everyone can get that is really great quality is Plugra. It's not cheap. It's not the cheapest butter, but it is the best butter in like a public supermarket that I think you can get. And if you can't get Plugra, just get the unsalted Land O'Lakes and stretch, you know, use that. That is a fine butter. It's a perfectly workable butter. It makes a great pie crust every single time. It's really consistent. It's a perfectly good butter.
Well, let's talk about France a little bit, because that's kind of this cool high note that I feel like you end the book on.
Yeah.
Or it's towards the end. I don't remember if it's the exact last chapter. So, I think it is the end. But there's a lot of perspective in there with what has come previously in the book and stuff. And you're talking about falling, you know, back in love with this rhythm of the kitchen and being with your daughter and being with your friends. And but coming from that southern place where you're, you know, okay, where's the buttermilk? Okay, the buttermilk's over here. Here's the perfect peaches that have just come in that they're perfect. Talk to me about going to France and looking at a different sort of bounty and what that was like for you, and just
Well, I'll start with what's so special about learning to cook in the South, which I think is such a strength when you're going elsewhere. And this is the thing I'm learning that I'm trying to communicate to younger cooks, which is if you can kind of learn, you know, obviously it's tropish to say if you can learn the rules, then you can break them. But that's not even what I mean. Like, if you can learn how to bring the best out of an ingredient, whatever ingredient that is, like learning how to identify its strengths and weaknesses. That's why I'm drawn to fruit. Like, taste the fruit. What does it need? What does it not need? How, like, I've put, I mean, I'm not like, you know, I'm not Alice Waters. This isn't Chez Panisse, but even at like Husk, when I got a perfect peach, I was very, very hesitant to do anything to that peach, you know? And so I would oftentimes just try to create as little around that peach as possible. I'm never going to put just a peach on a plate. Frankly, I don't think I've ever met a peach that deserves that yet. Like, you go to California and you can find an apricot that deserves to be next to a Bari date, and you're like, what? And then you eat it and you're like, oh my God. And it's perfect. And there's no reason to do anything to these things. And we do get beautiful, nearly perfect peaches, but I always kind of want to give it a little bit of something. And so for me, it becomes a reductive process of how to do just enough to bring out a specific highlighting of a flavor, whether it's buttermilk or a fruit or the pie crust or whatever. And I think the more you're tuned into your ingredient in your product, you can kind of do anything, right? Which I think is a very Southern way of baking, is paying attention to what is available to you, working with your atmosphere, your cooking conditions, what you have on hand is a really big way I learned how to cook, just in general. By and large, whenever I was, cooking out of my kitchen and selling cakes, I couldn't necessarily afford the ingredients to make the thing that someone was paying me $30 to make all the time, because I was never ahead of it. I was always like, you're going to give me $30? Okay, I need that $30 and you haven't given it to me yet. I've got 8 right now. What can I get? I definitely have to get the eggs and I definitely have to get the milk. What do I have? Oh, let me cut this with some cornmeal because I've got a bag of cornmeal that I can use. Well, what does that mean? That means probably I need to add some more buttermilk. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means I probably need to add some more baking soda. And all of a sudden you become masterful at knowing how to use what you have. And that to me is a huge strength of baking. And it takes a lot of that sort of intimidation out of it, and cooking in general. I think that's how people mostly cook, right? But no one ever puts that into the baking space. If you know enough about baking and you practice enough about baking, you can do it with baking too. And you might not always get the perfect thing, but you'll get something, and then you'll know what didn't work and what did work. And hopefully it's not for something you sold somebody. But so when I go to a place like France and I'm teaching cooking workshops and I'm taking people to markets, that's the lesson. The lesson isn't let's squeeze this into what we want. Let's instead put ourselves into this space, take what we can find, bring it back to the kitchen, size it up. What can we do? And figure it out then, which sounds really basic, but people actually aren't taught to do that. People get really, I think with this strange, weird, like chef culture that we've filled our kitchens with, there's this idea that there's a right way to do it, or there's an expectation of perfection. And sometimes you can just slice potatoes and put them in some hot oil and put some salt on them, and if you've got some pretty herbs from the garden, toss those in there. I mean, it's not, this is food. It's basic. It's a basic way of interacting. You can have missteps. It's okay. But the key is, of course, we're not talking about restaurant service. We're talking about going to the market and having a French workshop in France. The thing that is really important is sort of communicating the full potential of something. Like the butter in France is no joke. It's nothing like you can find anywhere. And it's becoming less and less easily found. You kind of have to go to these little niche places in Normandy. You can buy it for a lot of money in Paris, but it's getting harder and harder to find these like really pure ingredients that are so powerful whenever you're introducing someone to an ingredient. And to me, the conversation is always about what it needs and what it doesn't need, and just, eat that butter with some bread. Just put it on some bread and a little salt if it needs it, and eat it. And, that's a meal in France.
It's almost like you are discovering those things that would be in the margins of like all the old cookbooks that you've looked through, old church cookbooks that you've championed and looked through, our old grandma's recipes. Sometimes there's some instructions in there in the margins, sometimes there's not. But it seems like what you've come to is like discovering what all those margin comments would be. Right. Don't forget to do this. If you don't have this, add this. A lot of times that's not there in the recipe.
That's right.
So that's kind of like you're a conduit for that, I feel like.
That's nice,
just kind of cool.
Hear. And the version of that in the South wouldn't be butter and bread. It would be cornbread and buttermilk. And they're like the version of that in San Francisco is just a bari date. Like there are versions of that kind of simplicity. And then of course, like if you want to start crafting things around this, that's a different kind of skill. Right. But like, I think people need to be shown at this point in our weird cultural space that we're in that food is accessible to you, and it's meant to not to be cheesy, but it's just meant to nourish you. And that means nourish your comfort with it, nourish your like interactions with other humans over it. Like, if you feel intimidated going to a farmer's market because you've watched all these chef programs and it's failed, right?
Yeah.
Like you should be able to go and talk to a farmer and ask him what he would do with that chicken, because he knows the quality of that chicken. And I don't mean the quality as if good or bad. I mean, like, what's the meat like? He'll tell you. You can ask him that. You can say, like, is this a young chicken? What do you do with this? Do you stew it or do you fry it? What do you do? Like, what's it best for? That's a conversation you can have with a chicken farmer, and he'll tell you.
Yeah, and a lot of times that is going to be the most simple knowledge.
Totally.
Throw in the oven, 450.
Yeah.
30 minutes, done.
Yeah. And I've had farmers.
Don't do that at home.
I've had farmers tell me, like,
30 minutes.
Like, this is an old hen, brine it for, a couple of days.
Oh, yeah.
I've had farmers say that to me because they're not fooling. They're not like, a good farmer isn't anyway, like he'll say, like, this was one of my older hens, or this was this cow, or this was this. And, those relationships aren't exclusive to chefs.
Right.
They're just not,
Right.
you can have it too, and you should. And that's what would actually help stabilize a lot of the problems we're having is if you entered that space and owned it as a part of your life. Like, then our farmers get to make more, then we get to sustain more jobs, then we get to, and it becomes, I think for me, one of the biggest priorities, and of course, I love going to France and talking about food and being in France and having that experience. There's some self-servingness to it, but a really big agenda. And the bottom line for me is getting people to stop thinking that this is some sort of elite idea of food. It's not. Like, I know there's a cost. I get that. I have been very broke and without for several years of raising children. I understand that not everyone can afford to make these decisions, but you can pick one thing probably. You can pick one thing. I always had a very hard line agreement with myself because I was a vegetarian for a long time, and I started eating meat. I was working at all these great restaurants where I was meeting all these great farmers, and it made sense to me to take down that rule because I was no longer supporting industrialized farming. And that was my huge issue with it. I had a hard and fast rule, which I mostly still have. I play a little fast and loose with it now, if I'm being honest. But where if I was going to buy meat, I would buy meat. And I could only afford to do it once a month. Sometimes once every other month. And then, we ate a lot of beans and rice and cornbread, and I can buy all of that at Kroger, and we'd eat a lot of eggs. I'll buy that at Kroger. And then eventually I earned a little bit more money and I could buy my eggs at the farmer's market, almost exclusively. And so there's no, I'm not being flip about the cost. I understand it's not necessarily like the most sustainable way to be, but if we're being really honest, like most, this town has got some money, and everybody who has money after a certain point or after a certain demographic in this town should mostly be buying their food from these markets and from these farmers. And so it's just not a habit culturally that we're in. So that's a really big part of it for me, going to France and taking these people who obviously have means and having these conversations of accessibility and familiarity and not being intimidated by food, which is bonkers to me that we're in a place where people are intimidated by food.
Totally. Especially with all the knowledge out there and the kind of things are a little bit more accessible.
Yeah.
Knowledge is a little bit more accessible, I feel like. Now, you are a sculptor of words and of
Look at this segue.
Your husband is a sculptor, super talented, has an exhibit going on right now.
It actually just had its closing ceremony this past weekend, but it was a really remarkable show. He brought in over a dozen of some of the nation's best ceramicists, and it was a really great show at Elephant Gallery. And the whole purpose of the show was to open house his new community art initiative.
That's what I want to talk about.
Yeah, it's exciting, and thank you for giving me some space to talk about it, because it's hard to start something like this. So it's called Buchanan Art Center. It's on Buchanan Street in North Nashville. And he is working really hard. You know, he's having some starts and stops, obviously, and he's in a major fundraising push right now. The objective of the Art Center is to offer affordable community art education to middle schools and high schoolers in Nashville proper. You know, I've been raising kids. Both of my kids started and finished school in Nashville, Tennessee. And over the past 20 years, we've seen arts programming just get cut over and over again. And we've been fortunate benefactors of being in some of the magnet schools. Well, that's not true in the non-magnet schools, which is a whole other issue of the ways in which we politicize education. But that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is a lot of the local neighborhood schools, most especially in North Nashville, the most arts education that they have is basically one art teacher that comes one day a month, sometimes 1 day a week with an art trolley, and these kids get maybe 45 minutes of arts education in a really unfortunate way. And as a city, you know, it's infuriating to me that we are a city that supposedly is of creative people and, you know, a home of musicians and a home of artists. And, you know, once upon a time, you know, promoted itself as a community of artists, you know, whatever that category you fill. And we are underserving our kids unless they are going to wealthy private schools or fortunate enough to get lotteried into a magnet school. And even oftentimes those, you know, are programs that are struggling. We just aren't providing our kids with arts education in this city. So Watkins recently closed, and they were one of the forerunners for many years trying to give kids community arts programming. They've recently been bought by Belmont, so it's becoming further less accessible, you know, and sort of put into different communities that aren't, you know, kids that go to school in North Nashville or So he's trying to establish a program where he can start to, you know, get these kids brought in. Eventually the programming looks like we'll have some vans or buses where maybe we can provide transportation. But ultimately, there is being an arts curriculum is being written. He's got a really incredible strong board of local artists and art educators. And they are building and developing as we speak, hopefully, a program that Nashville will support that kids from all neighborhoods can come in after school and have a full afternoon and evening of arts education. And with any luck, they will be, you know, able to matriculate into universities from this programming. So they're building something that I think could be of incredible value. It's a non-for-profit. They got their non-for-profit status established this past summer. We hope that most of these kids can come at a very reduced rate based on their family's income, which you know, can be as little as $5 a month, but everyone will buy in just to value their experience on some level. But the objective is to give this to kids that can't necessarily pay out of pocket and certainly aren't getting it in the public school system. So
that's great.
I'm really proud of him. He's working really hard. He's learning. I mean, he's not a non-for-profit director. You know, he's a ceramicist and he's been teaching in academics for the last 25 years. And there's a lot to learn. There are a lot of, you know, it's a different world, you know, and he's very passionate about his work. And so learning how to sort of manage what he sees and what he knows this could be with getting people to buy in is an art form, you know. So it's interesting. It's interesting to watch him do this work, and I'm really proud of him. He's doing great. He's doing really great.
That's great.
It's going to take some time.
You can check out John Donovan's work at tenureceramics.com. Tenure Ceramics. Also follow him on Instagram at Tenure Ceramics. That is TENURE Ceramics.
Yeah.
And you can find that at buchananarts.org.
Thank you.
Head over there and really, really simple to just go to the website and you see that Donate Now button, and you can help with the cause there. You can look at the courses, you can volunteer, and you can check out all these different workshops going on. John Donovan will be doing some wheel throwing basics. That sounds like a good one to check out.
I think so.
So check that out for sure, buchananarts.org. And now you're also, before we go here, you were helping out the Giving Kitchen, which is coming into Nashville, which is a really important thing for this varied food scene that we have here in town. We have people from all over the world here. We have a really vibrant international cuisine culture. The Giving Kitchen, tell me a little bit about why they're so important, why it's so cool they're coming to Nashville.
Yeah, happily. So they started in Atlanta, Georgia, nearly a decade ago, I believe, at this point, when a member of our hospitality family in the South was diagnosed with cancer and rapidly declined, and they built this program. Ryan Heidinger and his wife Jen, and his sister Krista, and his brother-in-law Ryan, they started basically doing a tour around the South to raise money for his medical expenses, and he was not able to work. And as you know, anyone in the hospitality world, if they have to take time off for illness or whatever the case may be, often there's no safety net, if entirely never a safety net. And even if you take a day off, you struggle. I can remember, there were times where I really needed to take some time to be with my sick kids, and it was a conversation between which bill do we pay, and or do I have to go, whatever. Like there aren't a lot of options for people in the hospitality world to take care of themselves. And so it became really obvious with Ryan's illness and eventual death that something needed to happen. And they started the Giving Kitchen, which is a non-for-profit that was initially a restaurant, and they would raise funds for anybody in the hospitality industry, world, community, to have a place to say, I just got hit by a car on my bike, I have a broken leg, can't work for 2 weeks. They will pay your salary, and they will help with medical bills. They will help you in whatever way they can. And it started slowly, and it built up into now a multi-city organization. And Nashville is their second city. And it's really important, I think, for Nashvillians of all, of all demographics to understand that this is available to us. And Brian Schroeder, who's one of the directors of the program, they're in town this weekend. They had quite a big launch this weekend. And Brian Schroeder and I went to lunch. We went to Frida's, which is my favorite restaurant in Nashville, which is a Oaxacan restaurant on Nolensville Road.
Shout out Frida's.
Yeah, it's really great. And I was really, he and I had a really great conversation about my priority, I think, in helping them kind of infiltrate this town. It's easy to, I think it's easy for us to communicate with the restaurants and the no, right? These restaurants are always communicating with each other. They're on, Slack channels together talking about, I need a dishwasher. They're all communicating resources to one another. And then there's a whole other aspect of restaurant culture that is separate from that. And that is that's the part of restaurant culture that is something I really am concerning myself with at this point. We have an incredible immigrant community in Nashville. We have a huge Kurdish population. We've got a remarkable international community of restaurateurs and cooks and chefs, and oftentimes they get left out of these conversations of what our resources are as cooks and dishwashers and people who work in restaurants and hospitality. And so they're really pushing to sort of spread the word amongst like Conexión Americas and Turk and Workers' Dignity, and trying to kind of get the word out to people who necessarily aren't just for lack of better terms, like, the upper class white bro chefs, that all own restaurants, and they're doing their best to communicate this to their workers. But so often these other restaurants get left out of these conversations. So they're really trying to sort of spread the word to make sure that everyone understands that these resources are available to anyone who works in the restaurant industry. So check them out, The Giving Kitchen. They just launched in Nashville. And if you are a Nashville kitchen restaurant hospitality worker, is an incredibly valuable resource, and they are here for us. They're here for you, and they're doing incredibly important work to support, people who make a living in this world. So it is, not just, I think it's important for you to know it's an available resource for you, but also to make sure you are sharing with anybody that you work with, sharing with your bosses, sharing with your employees, sharing with your family, because if we don't use it, we'll lose it. And let's make sure that this is something that can get a foothold in our town.
Very cool. Yeah, you can check that out. givingkitchen.org. We've known people definitely who broke their ankle, or
I got hit by a car on my bicycle,
and then you're
broke 3 ribs and went to work. It was horrible.
Exactly. I mean, whenever you're trying to make the choice between, can I pay but what you're trying to do in this country is avoid 2 things: getting behind on your rent and not getting buried in medical bills.
Yeah.
And so not only can you not take time off because you can't afford it with your normal expenses, you also can't take time off because you're anticipating all of these new expenses that this injury or illness will give you, and you just feel doubly fucked. So they are here to help manage and mitigate those fears and expectations and true real-time worries. So definitely seek them out and let other people know that they're here to support us.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate it.
It was great.
It was amazing. Enlightening as always. And people can follow you on Instagram at Lisa Marie Donovan.
Sure.
To find out all the new events that might come up as the world starts to open up a little bit more.
Or interviews.
Interviews.
You did one last night. Glad you're getting around to doing
Me
the book
too.
tour.
It feels nice.
It's over a year later, and paperback is out. The audio book, which is how I read your book.
That's okay.
A lot of people have been into the audio book. I noticed.
I think so too.
I mean, in my experience, there were parts of the book where I wanted someone to be there with me, and honestly, to have you walking me through certain parts of the book, it was immeasurable how the emotion was different than just reading it on print.
Oh, that's good to hear, because you never know if you're gonna do it right by and.
No, it was brilliant.
Thank you. That feels good. Everyone seems to like the audiobook, so that makes me really happy.
The book is Our Lady of Perpetual Hunger, Lisa Donovan, essayist, memoirist, and future fiction novelist.
Oh, fingers crossed. I mean,
Can't wait for that.
We'll see.
Yeah.
Maybe when I'm in my 70s, I'll be one of these old crones.
That's the good thing about writing.
I agree.
You got time to do it. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
you can find us on Instagram at liquidgold_pod. Email us liquidgoldpod@gmail.com. And we encourage you, check out everything that's going on at We Own This Town, weownthistown.net. Shout out to our producer, Michael Eads.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you to Upright T-Rex Music for the tunes, Jess Matchin for the logo. All right, for my co-host, Mr. Kenneth Deadman, my name is Mike Wolf, and we'll see you next time on Liquid Gold.